Hello and welcome to this edition of Table Talk, a series of conversations with writers, academics, scholars, and activists who work on human-animal relations. We are the Indian Animal Studies Collective. I am Pande and my co-host is Susan Haris. Our guest tonight is Shazia Rahman from the University of Dayton, and we are going to be talking to her about her article, Animals, Others, and Postcolonial Ecomasculinities, Nadeem Aslam's The Blind Man's Garden. Before we start, I'd like to mention that this table talk is going to last for just an hour, so please feel free to join in with your questions and comments at any time. Please unmute yourself, raise a hand, or type your question in the chat box. A very warm welcome to you, Shazia. Thank you for accepting our invitation. We are really delighted to have this opportunity to discuss your work with you. I would like to start by asking you to elaborate on the term post-colonial ecomasculinity, especially with regard to how it presents an alternative to hegemonic masculinity.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the invitation. Yeah, post-colonial ecomasculinity, that's a mouthful. I mean, I can talk about how I came to the term. I'm a post-colonialist. I work on post-colonial literature, have been for a long time. And I started thinking about ecofeminism at some point. And then I read this novel that was about this character, this male character who was, I thought, behaving in a very kind of egalitarian way. And so I started reading about masculinity, and that's where I came across this term, hegemonic masculinity. I think in the popular discourse, when my students talk, they always talk about toxic masculinity. That's what they always want to talk about. That's very toxic or whatever. I think that is how it's used in sort of mainstream society. But I think that hegemonic masculinity is just a little bit different. One of my students was asking me about it last week, and in the moment I said, hegemonic masculinity is toxic masculinity. It's the same thing. But then this morning I woke up and I was thinking, it's kind of different, because hegemonic masculinity is sort of this term that sociologists use. And so it's a very academic term, which means that it's more, it's the masculinity that is most visible and most dominant, and men, like cis men, trans men, men are sort of expected to be like that. And so it's not necessarily toxic, although the toxic masculinity is definitely part of it. But it is all those things that men are, a manly man is supposed to be. And so it includes things like capitalism, right? Must earn unlimited growth, must earn lots of money. And it includes things like, winning, competition, domination. And that's when, this idea of being dominant, being a manly man, then can sort of spill over into your relations with others. So women, animals, the environment, all of that. And so hegemonic masculinity isn't always, I would say it isn't always as terrible as toxic masculinity, but it includes that, and it can certainly go in that direction. And I don't know if I've explained it. I don't know. If you have any questions, please stop me and ask questions.
Yeah, I was just thinking, listening to you right now, could one think of hegemonic masculinity as, if we borrow from Zizek, for example, who's speaking about all the forms that violence takes, and he says that there is a zero-level violence, which doesn't mean that it's not violence, only it's become the system, so to speak, and therefore it's perhaps not as visible or not explicitly seen as violence anymore, although it is violence, but it's been normalized because it underlies all the systems that society functions on. Could one think of hegemonic masculinity in the same way?
Yes, absolutely. It's so normalized that we don't even notice it, which is why I use that term manly man, because it's just so like everybody knows what a manly man is, it's everywhere, and there's this expectation, but actually it's kind of terrible because there's all kinds of men and boys in the world. There's so much heterogeneity across populations, and if you always feel like you have to be this certain kind of man, it can be so limiting. Um, it's a lot of times I talk about it as boxes, right? Like that patriarchy us, tries to put us into these binary boxes, like women are going to be feminine and men are going to be masculine, and it's just going to be this one kind of femininity and this one kind of masculinity. But I think that over the years, with the women's movement being old and being around, and there having been waves, there are waves in which femininity has been opened up for women. Uh, and I'm not convinced that that has happened as much for men. And um, so that's how I sort of made the move from ecofeminism to ecomasculinity, because I just started thinking about, you know, where are all our problems coming from, right? They're all coming from capitalism and patriarchy and all this sort of way of thinking and this way of being in the world that isn't humble. Like we all need more humility. And what is it that's keeping us from being humble? And maybe not needing unlimited growth, and I feel like it's this idea of masculinity, that this hegemonic masculinity that's keeping us uh, holding us back, um, and so maybe we need alternatives. Maybe we need to think differently about what it is to be a man, just like we've been thinking differently about what it is to be a woman.
And I was also curious about the pluralization in the title of your article, postcolonial ecomasculinities. So, what is the plurality that it denotes?
I just imagine, so I imagine that this is one novel, right? This is my reading of one novel in which I talk about a Pakistani male living on the border with Afghanistan, having these experiences, war on terror related experiences. And then there's this snow leopard, right? So all of this is happening in this novel. And I say that this is a kind of post-colonial eco-masculinity, but I am humble. And so I can imagine that there would be other kinds of post-colonial eco-masculinities that maybe would involve animals, but maybe in different ways. Maybe it would involve other aspects of the environment. Maybe it would have to do with the air, or the land, or the water, or So this is it's true that this is one sort of theorization that I came to because I was thinking about this one novel, but I think that if you're going to theorize some kind of egalitarian type of masculinity, then you shouldn't limit it. You should think of it in the plural, and so that's why the title is plural, even though I'm just talking about the one character.
So, more as the possibility or the potential of there being, let's say, regionally specific, locally different responses to hegemonic masculinity and to capitalism, to neocolonialism, etc., emerging from different cultural contexts. Okay, I get that. My next question is also about something that you referred to just a minute ago. You've also engaged, as you said, with post-colonial ecofeminism in your other research publications. So how different is post-colonial eco-masculinity from it? Or to put it in other words, if both approaches reject what Melchen calls the animacy hierarchy, how big a role does gender play in these responses, in their two responses to the realities of the post-colonial world, such as globalization, neocolonialism, etc.?
I think that a lot of us, people in different fields thinking about animals, I think a lot of us are sort of going in a similar direction, although not necessarily with the same history. So for instance, last week, this student was asking me I was talking about ecofeminism, and she was asking me about intersectional environmentalism. And my response to that, and, different people have different responses. My response to that was, it doesn't matter what the word is. It doesn't matter. As long as we get there, right? As long as we get there, as long as we're moving in this direction where we're insisting on seeing all of the intersections together, right? So we're thinking about animals, but we're also thinking about gender, and we're thinking about colonialism and race. Like, as long as we're thinking about things together, it doesn't matter if you get there from, she was talking about intersectionality. Intersectionality used to, when it started out, it was just race and gender, and then it sort of moved into intersectional environmentalism, right? Ecofeminism used to just be like gender and environment, but then it sort of moved into postcolonial and masculinity, and right. So I think that where we end up is what matters, and yeah, and every word has its own history. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it does to some extent. But would you say that gender plays a really decisive sort of role in distinguishing the kind of post-colonial responses that can emerge to the crisis that we find at hand now? Or would you say that it's more a question of, let's say that in this novel, there happened to be a male protagonist, and it revolves around his interactions with the more than human world around him, Mikal, and his relationship with the smoke, a leopard cub, or his ability to read the sky in order to orient himself. So with more than human elements, and because it happens to be a man, that one thinks of it in terms of ecomasculinity? Or do you think that there is, in that sense, a basic fundamental difference in what one would call ecofeminism and ecomasculinity?
Okay, so I am a feminist and pretty much have been for a very long time. And so for me, gender is part of everything, right? If I'm going to think about animals, then I'm going to think about it in terms of gender, whether it's, ecofeminism or ecomasculinity. To me, gender is something that I can't take off. I think of it as a hat, right? Like my feminist hat, I can't take it off. So if I'm thinking about animals, I still have my feminist hat on, and I can't help but think of it in a gendered sort of way. So I would say, because you're asking me, I would say that if we are in a situation where we have this terrible hierarchy where animals get the short end of the stick, that hierarchy is about patriarchy. That hierarchy is about the gender binary that we're sort of forced into. That hierarchy is about hegemonic masculinity. I would bring it all back to patriarchy. And I know that people don't like to hear that, because after my book came out, I was doing this interview situation, and there were people who were like, why are you bringing it back to patriarchy? It's all capitalism. And I said, I never said it wasn't capitalism, but capitalism is coming from this patriarchal hegemonic masculinity. That's where, so it's all connected. And so I can't I can't separate them. And you're right that I did just a little while ago say that there happened to be this male character, but somebody else reading maybe might not even notice that the character was male, maybe wouldn't even think of it as an issue of masculinity, wouldn't think of war as an issue of masculinity. But when you have your feminist hat on and you see everything in terms of gender, then you can't stop seeing it. I can't stop seeing it.
Yeah, I think I follow what you mean there. Also, because in this particular novel, war, and in particular the war on terror, is the backdrop against which all of these events play out, and that connects seamlessly with hegemonic masculinity. So I kind of see, the fact that Mikhail happens to be male is just one factor, but even if Mikhail wasn't male, and the backdrop was the same, I can kind of see that this would lead to the emergence of postcolonial ecomasculinity as a response, which would be distinct from, let's say, an ecofeminist sort of an approach. I was also wondering, how does the stance that you call postcolonial ecomasculinity embrace what Veena Das calls the non-transparency of certain animals? I request you to kind of engage with this non-transparency first of all a little bit, to see how you understand that. And then how does post-colonial ecomasculinity engage with or embrace the non-transparency of certain animals, even while it responds to different animals in different ways? You also quote Subhadeep Sinha and Amit Beshe's idea in your article that not all relationships between human and non-human animals are necessarily relationships of care. And yeah, that makes perfect sense. So what form can and does the negation of hegemonic masculinity take when confronted with an animal that is non-transparent? For example, an animal that one fears, or finds repulsive, or does not even notice because it's a bug or something.
Yeah. That is an excellent question that I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about, except to say that even you're absolutely right that we think of animals in terms of our pets, and we think of animals in terms of care, but really, I was recently reading that having pets is not necessarily good. Like having pets is still, have a cat, but having pets is still hierarchical, and it's not necessarily egalitarian, and it's not necessarily the right way to go. I like complexity, and so I like the idea that there are all these theorists who are questioning assumptions that people often make. But I don't know if I have much to add to that. And I see that Susan has had her hand up for a long time.
Susan, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, sure. This is just following up on what you said earlier. Especially in anthropology, I feel like when we're talking about Asian or any non-Western context, there's a tendency to explain a lot of situations with violence towards animals as alternative models of human-animal relationships. And since the post-colonial eco-masculinity is also an alternative model, I wanted to know, when you were talking about the common place that we all want to arrive at, would that common place be free of any kind of masculinity, or would that be free of any kind of patriarchy? And if the common goal that we arrive at still has a sociological component of gender, where there's, male and female models and other kinds of models, then do you think that relations with animals could be made more equitable only if they're equipped with rights? And I'm concerned about this because, it would, in my mind, be falling back on a Western model to kind of elevate animals. But I'm also concerned about saying, well, these are the alternative models, even if they seem to justify or explain violence using these alternative paradigms.
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot. And a lot of times in my work, I think of what I'm doing as a process and a project. So moving towards something that is better and trying to imagine something that's better, but it's not always, I'm not always able to imagine what it'll be exactly. So you see, the rights model, you're absolutely right. The rights model is Western. And could it be different? How could it be different? I guess for me, okay, so I don't know if you read that. There's this novel by, okay, it's a very difficult long name, Wu Dagan or something like that. Anyway, there's a novel about, it's like the story of a goat, is what it's called. And in it, the goat, you get sort of the life story of this goat. And as you get the life story of the goat, you see what the goat goes through. You see, well, because I'm a feminist, you see the goat as a woman, but then you also see, the issues with, they take her children away and she can't have a life with other goats. And then as soon as she tries to have a life with other goats, the other goats are taken away. And so I kind of, for me, when you read a novel like that and you think about that, then that is, then it makes you aware of the fact that animals, should maybe be thought of with the same care. It's terrible to use the word care, but with the same compassion and generosity as we would give to humans. But clearly that's not the world we live in. I mean, everybody eats meat, and I see somebody in the chat wants to talk about veganism. Do I think that veganism is the only way to go if we want to protect animal rights? I have a hard time saying only way. I have a hard time saying that. I'm all about pluralities and multiplicities. So yeah, I have a hard time saying only way. Is it a good way? Yes, I will say that it is a good way. But the only way, that's really hard. Yeah, it's really hard. It's definitely good, definitely ethical, but also hard. I kind of want to hear from you about what you think. Person who
on a personal level, I'm sorry, I just look terrible right now, but like on a personal level, I think the first step to protect animal rights is veganism. But the problem is a lot of people are not ready to accept that. So
no.
And it's really hard. Do you think that?
Yeah, I agree.
So do you think that foods are the especially meat-based foods, they are specially being prepared in such a way to induce people to consume them more than usual, like artificial, I don't know, spices and stuff, just to. So in a way, if the government or an industry decides to take action and shift towards veganism, what would your take be? Would that be possible, or is it not being done due to a certain agenda, or maybe the market, money-making policies?
Yeah, I mean, I think money, it always comes down to money, but it's also people's taste. And I have to say, the way in which masculinity gets talked about, it's often about eating meat, right? If you look at the stories that are told about, what is it to be a man, it's wrapped up with eating meat. And so on the one hand, capitalism, absolutely, but on the other hand, also masculinity. And so, but I think it would be great.
If I may
Divya.
add to that, I think that these are, let's say, ethical choices, and the component of choice is, of course, what matters here, right? These are not things that can be enforced and should not be enforced, but left open to people. And then again, I think that there are multiple approaches, multiple ways, this plurality that you talked about, Shazia, a little while ago, in conceptualizing what ecomasculinities could be, for example. And similarly, people's approaches to the welfare of animals can also take a variety of forms. I mean, someone abstaining from eating meat or other animal-based products, consuming them, does not necessarily translate into concern for animals. It's something that people do for a variety of reasons. And there might be people who do consume meat for a variety of factors who are still concerned about the welfare of animals in a variety of other ways. So maybe we sort of come back to your article now. And you've mentioned in it also, and you've discussed how a relationship with the animal other and a sensitivity to the animal other is not in itself enough, not in itself sufficient to overcome the problems of racism, hegemonic masculinity, and ethnocentricity, and that a lack of privilege is a key factor as well. Could you elaborate on what you mean by privilege here, and how is it a hurdle to the emergence of a postcolonial ecomasculinity? So the term privilege, and then how does it function as a problem?
Well, when you have a lot of privilege, a lot of times you sort of feel entitled. And then in that entitlement, there is arrogance. And in that arrogance is, the humility seems to go away. And so privilege can be a problem. And the way I was talking about it in my article was there was a soldier, a white American soldier in the sort of same place as the Pakistani character. And both of them really loved the snow leopard. And both of them cared for the snow leopard. And both of them wanted the snow leopard to be okay. But it turned out that the privilege of the white American was such that it wasn't, his relationship to the snow leopard wasn't the same. Similarly, there was a very sort of patriarchal, the blind man from the title of the novel, very patriarchal man who's eventually he does go blind. He has this lovely relationship to birds. He loves birds, and but he isn't able to, because of his sort of male privilege. So this time it's not sort of race privilege, it's more male privilege. Because of his male privilege, he isn't able to sort of see and feel compassion for women who are sort of oppressed by patriarchy. And so privilege, whether it's male privilege or white privilege, whatever the privilege is, it can sometimes blind you to certain things. Yeah, I think that was my point that I was trying to get across, and I think I gave a couple of examples. So the privileges can sometimes be like blinders.
And in the case of the American soldier, would you agree that on the one hand, it is the race privilege, the white American soldier in Asia? And would it also be, if we look at it against the backdrop of the war on terror, the privilege of almost the occupiers, so to speak, in a political condition where the power is sort of lopsided, where it's all on one side? So also privilege in terms of political power, right? Or extra judicial, extra political, sort of biopolitical power.
Yeah, there's so much power to use satellites to find people, to torture people, to set up situations where you can, try and get information out of them, and just all of the things that, parts of this novel are actually really hard to read, were very hard to read for me, because, violence and torture is not exactly, I don't go out there looking for novels with all of that in it. But it's all there, and I think Nadim Aslam chose to make it pretty graphic, so that you can see what's going on and how it works, and how how there's just so much hate in the world, right? He actually doesn't. It's very much a post-colonial novel, so you have a sense of the aftermath of colonialism in the novel, but you don't. He doesn't let people off the hook, right? Like he shows the ways in which, Islamophobia works, but then also the ways in which Muslims can be really make assumptions about people just because they're not Muslim, make assumptions. Yeah. So I think that that's why this character McCall is so interesting. It's because he sort of looks beyond a lot of the hate, and is, when I teach this novel, a lot of times I tell my students that yes, there's a lot of violence and graphic violence and in it, but this is actually a novel about love. It's about how to love in the face of all this violence and hate. Maybe I lost track of your question. Oh no, I can't hear you.
Hear you. Oh no.
You're muted. Maybe you can unmute.
Yeah, sorry. That little problem sometimes of forgetting that one is muted. I just wanted to say that I lost you for a couple of seconds there, but now I can hear you again,
Okay.
so that's kind of okay. The other thing that I noticed about the novel, while acknowledging that I haven't yet read the novel, but based on your article on the novel, it seemed to me that it's also very nuanced and very balanced in two respects, at least. Probably in a whole lot others, but two that stood out for me, where there's a scene where Mikal sees this wall which is blood splattered, a mark which is lower than the height of an adult human, and figures out that a child was shot dead at that spot. And immediately after that, there's a scene of a dog, a street dog, being shot dead. And I found that also interesting and moving, how the human and the non-human are sort of presented in the same frame. to drive home the fact that this sort of biopolitical terror and violence does not affect only one or the other of the presences, but basically all. And the other instance was where there is a woman who whose husband has been killed by the Taliban, is that it? And she shoots Mikal's brother dead, right? And there again, I thought it was interesting how the lines between, victim and perpetrator are kind of blurred, because it depends on the circumstances, it depends on the given situation, who is who. So there aren't these sort of fixed roles of subject and object, perpetrator and victim, but that these are constantly changing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's a really, really important point, that the novel really shows that it's actually not about your sex, right? You're just because you're a cis woman doesn't mean that you aren't gonna be violent, and you aren't gonna be hateful, or like it's not about your genitalia, right? It's actually about how you are in the world, and about your circumstances, and all of that. And actually the part where you sort of see the violence against children and the violence against dogs, and you see it together and you see the connections, it really reminded me of the ways in which, perpetrators of domestic violence, are likely to treat their dogs badly, and it doesn't just, it's not like it doesn't end. It's all connected. I thought that the novel did a good job of showing that.
Right. And something else that you mentioned in your article, which I found really interesting also, was the reference to the Quran, and how it refers to the shared helplessness and vulnerability of human and non-human animals, and does not subscribe to the view that there exists a hierarchy wherein the human is placed above the animal. To what extent would you say does this cosmology inform The Blind Man's Garden, the novel that you worked on, as well as possibly other works from the Indo-Pakistan subcontinent which depict a more than human world? Have you come across such an approach in other works as well?
When I discovered that book, Animals in the Quran, I was just blown away, because, I hadn't come across it. But then, I read this novel, and there it was. And so, yeah, no, I was grateful to find out about it, but I haven't seen it elsewhere, which is why I really felt the need to write about this novel. I know not everybody likes this novel, but I just saw so much going on with it, and yeah, that hierarchy is often thought of as something that comes from religion, right? The hierarchy in religion says God, man, woman, animals, right? And yet to sort of have this different way of thinking about Islam, at least through the Quran, that we all suffer, and so there are ways in which we are similar. That was really, it was useful for my thinking.
If I remember correctly, we've had one other guest in the past. Susan, perhaps you can correct me. But I think when we had a table talk with Anand Taneja, this idea had come up. He's sort of referred to this reading of the Quran as well. But these are the only two instances where one comes across it. And I find it really refreshing, because it seems like such a progressive approach, especially given the rise of human animal studies and our contemporary times, to find that there exists this idea already in religion. Because I think a lot of the scholarship emanates from countries which largely have a Christian sort of tradition and model of looking at the world. And there, I think this hierarchy is a given. So one has to sort of push against it, question it, and whatever. But here we've got a context in which this hierarchy doesn't exist, and there is this egalitarian idea. So, yeah, I wish there would be more novels forthcoming, or more secondary literature as well forthcoming that one could engage with. We'll keep our eyes open, and I'm sure we'll find more. The other thing that I wanted to ask you about was the scope for becoming with a companion species in a Donna Haraway sort of sense. In postcolonial ecomasculinity, you refer to this also in terms of Mikal's encounter with the snow leopard cub. Does it matter? What do you think? Does it matter whether this animal other is a transparent animal other or a non-transparent other?
You know, I don't think, to me, the sensibility is what matters. The way in which you interact with the other is what matters more than who or what the other is, right? That it's the open, compassionate response to others, and that's why when I was giving the article a title, I wanted it to say animals, others, because animals definitely are othered, and there is a way in which you can be more open to animals, but I think that but it's the sensibility for me. It's the way of thinking that matters to me. If you and then using that way of thinking to interact with all kinds of others, that matters more to me. And going back to what you were saying earlier, I consider the idea of ecomasculinity as something that comes out of ecofeminism. I consider it, so ecofeminism, so I tell everybody my feminism includes trans women, my feminism includes the environment, my feminism includes all these things, right? So ecofeminism, ecomasculinity, to me, that's where the feminist goes next, right? The feminist thinks in terms of gender. The feminist thinks in terms of the ways in which patriarchy is so binary, right? And the feminist sees that the non-binary is a place to move towards, and so if we've been thinking about femininity for a long time, we need to also think about masculinity. So I actually don't think of them as two separate things, but like one is the larger and one is part of it. I don't think I explained that very well last time, so.
No, thank you for this. This does make things clearer and add to the position you take on this. So thank you for that. There is also this instance where in the novel that you refer to, where Mikal has been tortured as a prisoner, and in that sense, this torture is Mikal's exposure, let's say, to hegemonic masculinity all over again, and the animacy hierarchy. And Mikal is dehumanized through this encounter, through this exposure, and loses his ability to read the sky. So we could understand this as this exposure to hegemonic masculinity and animacy hierarchy makes Mikal lose his ability to relate to other non-human elements around him. Excuse me, could you keep your microphone switched off, please? Murugavel-T, please switch off your microphone. Thank you. So is this encounter with torture and with hegemonic masculinity a sort of a breakdown of ecomasculinity, or is it a temporary setback from which this stance can emerge and does emerge stronger and more self-aware? Is this like a limitation, or is this something that that ecomasculinity arises from?
I don't think it arises from it. I think that I think it yeah, I would say that violence and torture and those things actually dehumanize you to the point where you can no longer interact with the world with this sensibility, because you can no longer be yourself. And so I don't see it as, and I think in the novel, you know, he lost his ability to relate to the world. He lost his ability to read the stars. And it's true that some of it was still there, and he found it again, but it didn't come out of the torture. The torture came later and took a lot away from him. And I think that's why I'm so interested in masculinity now, because I think that we cannot continue down this violent capitalist unlimited growth, more path. We just can't. It's not, it's destroying us all. And so yeah, I didn't see it as coming out of the torture at all. The torture took away too much.
But only temporarily, right? I mean, he bounces back.
In the novel, it is temporary, but I can imagine it not being temporary.
Right. I have just one last question. So, quoting from the novel, Nahid imagines what the boys will be like as young men, reserved in manner on the whole, but with a component of laughing wildness in the personality, revealing itself occasionally. So these ropeways, these kind of bridges to the other, etc., are, you know, they are beautiful images and a sort of a portent of what's to come in the future, or in a better future. So is post-colonial ecomasculinity, as you conceptualize it, to be understood as an alternative which is already given, which exists, or rather as a potential or even a utopian ideal?
I think it already exists, and it just needs to be sort of talked about more and thought about more. Yeah, no, I think it absolutely exists. I think so. So I have a son, and I think that when you're like the parent of a child and you watch the child grow, and if the child is a male child, you start to think about these things in ways that become more yeah, it just feels like this is something, it becomes urgent. And so I think that's why I really love this novel, is because it ended with this woman raising these boys, these young boys, and thinking about their fathers, but one of the fathers is Mikhail, and thinking about how, like, what is it, how can these boys do interact with the world in a way that is not destructive, right? And so, and the fact that the blind man can't get around without the ropes creates this image that I just thought was so beautiful, because it means that there are connections between these places. To get from one place to another place, you are connected. And so, yeah, it seemed to me to be saying that this is a way to move through the world, and it's a better way. It's a way that is more about bridges and connections and less about separations and borders. And so, yeah, and that's why I say that the masculinity comes out of the feminism, because the feminist thinks about how to raise the next generation of boys. And you can raise boys to be more patriarchal or not.
Thank you. Divya, did you want to ask a question?
Yes, ma'am. Actually,
Please
I
go
would
ahead.
like to add something. Yesterday, I watched a movie, Christopher. It's a Malayalam movie and starring Mammootty. You might have heard about it. Okay, so in that movie, by attending this session, I could correlate hegemonic masculinity with the movie theme. And we see a lot of violence that really happened in Kerala when a girl says no to a guy who proposes her. That guy may pour petrol or acid, and how those girls are affected. So those realistic things are being depicted in the movie. And about substance abuse, there is a person who is a substance abuser who runs an industry where they make statues out of cement. Okay, so when he's in his high of this drug, he just throw his pet. He's holding a pet, his own favorite puppy, and he just throw it to a grinder, a cement grinder. So all the employees out there in that company got shocked. Okay, he's the manager. The one who throws is a manager of that company, that cement industry. Sorry, statues made out of cement. And he rapes a girl and he throws the woman's body into the same grinder. So we could relate the substance abuser, and he's also an animal abuser and also a woman abuser. So I'm just relating what I watched yesterday to this talk. Thank you. And also about the veganism concept. And I'm a non-veg, and nowadays I'm reading about veganism, and I'm doing PhD in animal studies from NIT Warangal. So I'm just I was thinking like, can I be a real animal activist without being a vegan? And what I read in a book called Animals and Society by Margot de Mello, she says that there are, as Pande also mentioned, there are people who are non-vegetarians, who are animal activists, and also vegetarians who are not animal activists. So it's okay to be a non-vegan or non-vegetarian and be an animal activist, right? Thank you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think there are many ways to interact with the world. And yeah, there isn't only one way. I don't think that is helpful to say that there's only one true way.
I think it also
Thank
works
you.
the same way with religion to some extent, between saying that one is a complete non-believer and saying one is a devout believer. There are, a whole range of positions between these two extremes, and one need not choose either this or that. And each person should have the agency, the right to sort of situate themselves, go as far as they comfortably want to or can. So yeah, multiplicity again, plurality.
Absolutely. And also, I think it's important to think about the stretch of time, right? Like, so over the course of years and years of living, people interact differently with the world. And, a lot of times people will say, oh, well, you used to have that position. Now you have this position. Oh, you're such a hypocrite. No, humans are bundles of contradictions, and we grow, we change, we become. That's why I focus more on the idea of the project, on the process moving forward, rather than the end necessarily.
Thanks, Divya, for your really interesting comment there, and the reference to the movie Christopher. Good, we all need to watch it as well. Susan, did you have a question?
Yeah, I think it's a fitting last question.
Finale. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to know what you think about, because we discussed Haris' species interdependence, and we were talking about plurality and multiplicity. I always feel like there is some underlying ontology to these concepts, as in that they could be applied to animals everywhere and kind of flattens, whatever biographies they may have. So I want to know, in the context of this novel, or more generally, what do you think is the post-colonial when it applies to the animals? In this case, are they always in relation to the humans and the human lives? Even if we consider, as you said, Mikal may not come across as a man, or even as the main protagonist to some readers. But if we were to center the leopard cub or any of the other non-human characters as the central figures, how would we describe what is post-colonial to their lives?
So, yeah. So just to sort of move back, it took a long time for animal studies to become part of sort of post-colonial. So post-colonial, and part of the reason for that is that with colonialism, one of the things that the colonizer did, not just in India, but all over, was animalize the colonized. And because the colonized were animalized, it took a long time to, and I actually think that this is why in post-colonial contexts, there's this desire to not want to talk about animal rights. That's Western, right? I think that pushback comes from the history of colonialism and from the history of us being animalized ourselves, right? And I think that history then sort of, this is what I meant about history of words and history of ideas. Like, you have to sort of see where it's coming from to understand why it is the way it is. And I think that, well, I mean, I really understand why it's like that. I get it. I completely get it. I just think that in this historical moment, we have to, as you obviously do, Indian Animal Collective, right? You're already doing it. We have to not let that hold us back. The fact that we have a history of being animalized by the colonizer should not keep us from thinking of animals in ways that are different, or that are non-dominating, or that are, I did just a little plug. There's a journal, South Asian Review, and I wrote the introduction. Maybe you know about it, but I talked about it in there, about how ecofeminists had been talking about animals for a long time. White ecofeminists were talking about animals for a long time, and for a long time, post-colonialists had a hard time with it, because it was easier for the white ecofeminist to say, don't do that to cows. You're treating us like you're treating the cows the way you treat us. Don't do that, right? It was easier for them to do that because they didn't have this history, right? The post-colonialists had this history. And so, but to me, so maybe post-colonialists come to it late. In the end, it's important work that has to be done. And I'm glad that you guys are doing it. Thank you, post-colonial Indian Animal Collective. That's your name, right?
Yeah, the Indian Animal Studies Collective.
Animal Studies
Thank
Collective.
you.
Thank
yes. Thank you again, Shazia, for being here, for making the time, and for this a long discussion that we've had. This is about all we have time for now. But we look forward to seeing some of you back again at our next installment of Table Talk. Keep watching the usual spaces. You'll see the posters up when we're ready to go. Have a nice day and a nice evening, depending on where you are.
Thank you.